There were two reasons behind my decision to purchase a 350-pound Honda XR650L. Firstly, it was the cheapest running dual sport I could find on Craigslist that day, and secondly, I had to find out for myself what this bike was all about, because I'd seen a lot of polarized opinions, with some people saying the 650L is practically useless off-road, and others saying it's their favorite off-road bike ever. It's kinda hard to figure out what's actually going on there. So in this video, I'll share my take on the XR650L and add to all that confusion. The XR650L was released in the US in 1993 and has remained mechanically the same ever since, with only tiny insignificant updates, color changes, and bold new graphics year to year. So this thing has gone 2.5 decades on the same design. That's pretty much unheard of. So there must be something good about this bike if people keep buying enough of them to convince Honda to just keep pumping them out year after year. And if you ask me, it's the power plant on this thing that is a winner. The engine is a 644cc, 4-stroke, air-cooled, single overhead cam, 4-valve, dry sump, over square single cylinder with a 42mm CV carburetor and a wide ratio 5-speed transmission. And I just love the way this big single delivers power in the dirt. To be perfectly fair, the bike I'm running has already been uncorked, desmogged, and has an FMF muffler, so it's possibly a bit more peppy than a completely stock bike. But anyway, based on what I'd heard about this bike online, I was expecting totally lame power, garbage throttle response, and acceleration that would make a John Deere look fast. But that is not what I've experienced with this bike. It's definitely not super slow, definitely not fast either, but in terms of acceleration, it's a little quicker than both my XR250R and CRF250X, which means it's more than good enough for me, but it's a 650, and it's only about as fast as a 250 trail bike? So what's up with that? Well, besides weighing nearly 100 pounds more than my 250s, which we'll talk about later, the engine on the 650 is built with extremely conservative, usable power delivery in mind. And that's a good thing if you ask me. When first taking off on the 650L, it's apparent that there's an enormous rotating mass in that motor, producing a hefty flywheel effect. It can lug down to way low RPM and just keep chugging, even when hardly touching the throttle. Breaking open the throttle at low RPM, even right off idle or slightly below idle, reveals surprisingly decent throttle response. I have generally been disgusted by the lack of low RPM throttle response on other bikes equipped with a CV carb, but the XR650L has no such issue. It always barks to life, never bogs, and never feels like it doesn't have enough power at low RPM. Despite the ultra-heavy rotating mass, the single 650 slug has enough punch to make you feel every single power stroke. It never even gets close to feeling out of control though, because even revving freely, it does not climb RPMs quickly at all. So the low RPM running on this engine is just excellent. It puts up a mean fight against stalling, though I've still managed to kill it here and there. The throttle response isn't laggy, and it has a gutsy pull whenever you need it. Unfortunately, if you're running a 90% or greater off-road biased tire like I am, it is way easy to tear it up on the street, even when trying to accelerate super easy just to get to the trails. There's not even an attempt at a cush drive anywhere on this bike, not even a judder spring in the clutch. So on takeoffs and low RPM cruising, the rear tire bears the brunt from every 650cc power stroke. This also sucks for the splines on the countershaft. When I received this bike, it had 20,000 miles on the odometer, which had stopped working in 2004, and it showed a little bit of wear on the countershaft splines. 2 weeks of getting lugged around pretty hard in the desert later, and the countershaft spline wear was getting out of hand. So I had to throw on an XR650R sprocket to stop the spline wear, and that has worked so far. Moving on from the low RPM performance, the mid RPM performance is also perfectly healthy. The power ramps up just a bit transitioning from low to mid, and it does so in a cleanly and perfectly controllable fashion, and at peak power the bike will really get moving and can carry the front end just as well as my 250s can. It even chugs out a 0 to 60 mph time of 6.1 seconds, which is respectable for a factory dual sport and slightly faster than my 250s. But it is slow for such a large displacement bike. Personal opinion time, that doesn't really matter to me. It has good usability in the dirt, not straight line pavement acceleration, and I prefer that. And as far as the high RPM performance on the 650L goes, it's non-existent, literally. The bike only revs to just over 7,000 RPM, at which point it has already fallen so flat on its face that it literally feels like VTEC unkicked in yo. So as long as I'm not screaming it too high, it does always pull nicely. So overall, the power on the XR650L in my case is enough to satisfy my needs and nothing more, and I mean that in a good way. It accelerates as well as my 250s in the dirt, has the throttle response to conquer off-road terrain, and it has enough guts to hang with cars on the freeway. The transmission is also not too shabby. As far as the clutch goes, it has a standard clutch pack without a judder spring, but it still manages to have a decently progressive engagement, which seems to come from the 650L having a relatively high lever ratio on the clutch lifter. Clutch durability on this bike is certainly better than your average off-road machine, as the bike I'm riding has the original clutch in it and it still has plenty of grab. Enough grab to pop up the front end whenever I need to. Considering the bike is so heavy, that's saying a lot. The clutch performance does change with heat buildup, fading out just a bit when it gets really hot, but not enough to become slippery and frustrating like on some bikes. But people who have a weak clutch finger might not like it so much. It doesn't have a super easy pull. Even with a brand new, lubricated, perfectly routed cable, I couldn't get the clutch pull to feel very light. But it's not too stiff for my clutch finger, and since the clutch grabs well enough, I can totally forgive a clutch pull that is slightly heavier compared to my other off-road bikes. Shifting this particular 650L is not super smooth. Compared to my 250X, where shifting only requires the slightest nudge of the shifter, shifting the 650L feels like trying to throw some heavy-duty industrial lever. Of course, that's an exaggeration, but it really is a big difference compared to a more modern dirt bike transmission. The 650L transmission has more slop to it, and you have to move that shift lever with some authority to get the next gear to engage. That's all relative to other off-road machines though. It's not like the 650L transmission is dysfunctional at all. It's fine. I've experienced dysfunctional transmissions before, and this is far from that. And the 650L doesn't need to be shifted around much when riding off-road anyway. The gear spread is super wide ratio in the first 3 gears, with an especially enormous throw between first and second gear, and since the bike can lug down to super low RPM, I generally find myself using second gear at the lowest, but mostly just staying third gear for an entire trail. At the most, I use it like a 3-speed transmission. Second gear for low-speed technical areas, third gear for most typical stuff, and fourth gear for the wide open stretches. Those 3 gears will take this bike from 0 miles per hour to 70 easily, and the torquey motor doesn't mind the spacing between those gears at all, so it works out. On the road, it cruises 65 pretty comfy in 5th gear without screaming, so no complaints from me when cruising on the road with this thing. So overall, as far as being able to lay down usable power at any off-road speed, I do like the engine package on the XR650L. I was not let down. In fact, I was pleasantly surprised by how well it works off-road. But I do see why some people say it sucks. It's a 650 that really only accelerates as fast or slightly faster than a 250 trail bike. Some people probably see the big 650 number and think, ooh, that's gonna slay all the 450s for sure. Unfortunately, that's pretty far from how it actually performs. So that's probably where most people's disappointment comes from. And how about fuel efficiency and reliability? As far as fuel efficiency goes, it's both impressive and disappointing. The impressive part is that when shredding this thing as wildly as I can in the desert, it achieves 23 miles per gallon. That beats out my CRF250X by just a bit, and that's impressive given that this bike weighs so much and has such a large displacement. So with the stock 2.8 gallon fuel tank, the XR650L can run at desert race pace for 64 miles. That's totally acceptable for a stock bike. But I'm guessing most people won't be desert racing on an XR650L, so just riding normally through the desert trails results in 30 miles per gallon and a range of 84 miles. Still pretty good, but the on-road efficiency of the XR650L is just not very good. The highway MPG I recorded was 44 miles per gallon, not even close to the 52 mile per gallon estimation given by Honda. And 44 miles per gallon? It's just a little disappointing when a bike is less efficient than my car. But my XR650L is 2.5 decades old with original wheel bearings and off-road biased tires, so it's probably just mine that sucks. Anyway, at 44 miles per gallon, the highway range with the stock tank is 123 miles, which is just okay. City riding results in 32 miles per gallon, which gives just under 90 miles of range, and that just isn't fantastic. To get a feel for reliability, let's take a look at this 1993 bike. It had 20,000 miles according to the odometer, but that broke back in 2004, and the motor is still in fine condition. It's all original, there's no cam chain noise. I tried to measure the oil consumption, but it simply didn't consume much oil. There aren't any leaks, though the stator side cover did get busted in at one point, and the valve clearances have never required an adjustment. The only area of concern is the wear on the countershaft splines, which was taken care of with an XR650R sprocket. To be over 2 decades old and have 20,000 plus miles and still be almost perfect is at least not bad for a single-cylinder dual sport. And in case you're wondering, this 650L lived its life filled with low-cost diesel motor oil, and since it survived so long on that in the hands of the previous owner, I've been continuing his experiment. Seems to be working fine to me. And while we're on the topic of motor oil, the 650L does use a dry sump system, employing the front down tube of the frame as an oil reservoir. The oil capacity is about 2 liters, which is plenty for a single-cylinder engine, and it's nice to have that much and not have to check the oil level all the time like on some bikes. Just note that before checking the oil level using the dipstick at the top of the frame, the bike has to be run for several minutes to get the oil pumped up out of the crankcase, otherwise the dipstick will come up completely dry. But enough about the engine, time to go over the suspension, brakes, and handling. So the XR650L is way heavy, fairly tall, and has a high center of gravity. Everyone knows that. But for some reason, before I purchased it, I was thinking it would still feel fine off-road and it would just be a bit slower to maneuver than the lighter bikes. Well, my first off-road ride on the 650L was eye-opening. It was not a pleasant ride. It was a struggle. Far more of a struggle than I had anticipated. I've seen people saying that the weight of these bikes makes them more stable than a lighter bike in the desert. That is just not true. Riding off-road is a series of controlled slides and careful recoveries when reacquiring traction, and this bike made it so difficult to not high side when doing that because of all the mass that gets slung around when making those transitions. Add in forks that are undersized and overly flexible for a 350-pound bike, and you have wallowy, wishy-washy handling with no feel at the front end. It was actually pretty sketchy on that first ride. I was becoming afraid of this XR650L and thought maybe I should just get rid of it before it got rid of me. But then something happened. The battery box, by the force of its own ridiculous weight, broke off within an hour of bouncing around in the desert. This presented a great opportunity to switch to a small lithium battery and ditch the battery box entirely, so that's what I did. The swap dropped around 8 pounds from the bike, but based on the sketchy ride I had just endured, I didn't think 8 pounds of weight reduction would be enough. So I started removing everything I could until I had removed 18 pounds from the bike. 18 pounds of weight reduction plus several days of practicing riding the still heavy 650L was enough to get me comfortable on the bike. So for the rest of this review, I'll be discussing a bike that is significantly lighter than a standard XR650L, because the full weight XR650L was pretty much just a no-go in my book. Starting with the front forks, the XR650L is equipped with 43mm conventional cartridge forks with externally adjustable low-speed compression damping, air adjustability, and about 11.5 inches of travel. The first thing you'll notice about these forks is just how far the lower section of the fork sticks out past the axle. They stick out so far, it leaves the forks with very little ground clearance. Not a really good thing out here in the rocky desert. The only catastrophic fork failure I've had out here was from a fork taking a rock to the lower part of the fork. So when I look at these forks that stick way out, it looks like they're just asking to get busted open. The next thing you'll notice are the Schrader valves at the top of the forks. Normally, forks have air valves just so you can equalize the pressure with the atmosphere where you're riding, but according to the manual, these forks are actually designed to be pumped up to add a preload to the air spring effect, which is a little different but kind of cool. And how well do the forks work? Well, they're a lot more flimsy than I think they should be, but that's just me. Other people might not mind. It's not a deal breaker, I'm just not a big fan of the vague feeling and lack of feedback on this front end, but I can deal with that. In every other way, they seem pretty decent. The compression damping isn't harsh at all, allowing for a smooth action over most rough square edge hits. They float really well through rocky sections. 11.5 inches of travel is a lot for conventional forks, and they don't bottom much, at least not with my 140 pounds of weight on there. And when they do bottom, the rebound afterward is controlled just like you'd expect from a decent cartridge fork. So the forks are decent. They're not going to be able to go skimming through desert whoops like it's a race machine, but they're not unbearably bad either. They definitely get the off-road job done. The front brake of the 650L has a disc that is slightly larger in diameter than other full-size XR bikes, and it really needs that increase in diameter to help slow down all that weight. It's good enough and feels fine until it's time for straight line maximum braking. It could use a little more grab in that situation. If you ask me, Honda might as well have gone with an even larger front rotor, since those huge fork lowers act as a brake guard anyway. The rear end features a fairly typical piggyback reservoir shock with externally adjustable low-speed compression damping, externally adjustable rebound damping, and threaded spring preload collars. The only thing I'd like to point out is that the valving used on this shock has a lot more high-speed damping than the rear shock of my XR250R. You'd think that they would make the dual sport bike have the softer setup, but it's the other way around. This isn't a bad thing. If anything, it's a win for the XR650L because the shock doesn't blow through and bottom out so easily. The XR650L shock is actually what I wish my XR250R shock felt like. Smooth and easy going on low speed compression damping, but just enough high speed damping to keep it from blowing through all the time. And the rear brake is a typical single piston caliper on a 220mm disc, just like the rest of Honda's full-size XR lineup. It works fine, but it's not nearly as aggressive as the rear brakes you'll find on modern bikes, and I'd bet that most people wouldn't want it to be more aggressive anyway. And of course, a steel frame ties it all together. This frame is quite a bit more beefy than the frame of my XR250R, and it's more than just enough to handle the extra weight, it's beefy enough to feel noticeably more rigid off-road. It's not harsh or anything, but hopping onto the XR250R definitely makes me realize how much flimsier the frame is on that bike. So how's the overall handling of the XR650L? Well, even with a lot of weight reduction, the heavy weight and high center of gravity is a detriment to the bike's handling performance. It's not that it can't corner well, it's just that it takes a lot more effort to make it corner safely, and it's just so tiring compared to lighter bikes. Besides that, the flimsy front end is the only other glaring deficiency that I don't like about the handling. But while I don't share this exact opinion, I can totally see why some people don't even consider this bike as off-road capable. It is tall, it is stupid heavy, and I don't ever want to ride one that hasn't been lightened up again. As far as electronics and lighting, the XR650L uses a DC CDI ignition system, which requires that the batteries stay connected to keep the ignition system running. This, plus the lack of a Kickstarter, means you have to make sure the battery doesn't get run dead. Otherwise, you just have a totally dead bike. Luckily, the stator output is rated at 180 watts at 5,000 RPM. That is definitely a healthy amount by off-road standards, so I wouldn't hesitate to run a few accessories or some extra lighting. If somehow someone needed more than 180 watts of stator output, they could even upgrade to a Honda VT700 or VT750 stator, a direct bolt-in which ups the output to 330 watts, and that's just crazy overkill, but the option is there. Another note about the DC CDI ignition system is that the plug-in CDI controller boxes for this bike are not very reliable. I have two CDI boxes for my bike. The original one, which cuts out and then needs to be thrown on the ground to get it going again, and a newer one which works fine. It's such a shame that the reliable motor is somewhat prone to cutting out because of poorly made CDI boxes, but at least it is always an easy fix whenever one craps out. As far as the lighting, well, it's tough to judge since the previous owner lost all of it except for the headlight and front blinkers. But the headlight works well, just like you'd imagine given how freaking massive it is. The brightness isn't very intense on low or high beam, but the high beam has a nice, clean, and usable pattern with plenty of throw, making it actually good enough to go for a little off-road night ride. Price versus performance. So XR650Ls have been around for a long time now, but they've been the same bike the entire time. So you can get a used one from the 90s and save thousands compared to a new one. This one cost me a total of $1,600 US after spending on parts to set it up so it felt good to me. That's a pretty good price for a bike. But based on performance, should this XR650L even be worth $1,600? I measured the XR650L's performance a couple times on the same desert course that I measure all my other bikes on to see how it compared. As it would turn out, my XR650L, XR250R, and CRF250X all consistently fall within 2.8% of each other in overall performance, which is fairly close, but the prices vary by over 100%, which is not close at all. The XR650L fell right between the XR250R and CRF250X in terms of price versus performance, with the CRF250X losing due to a much higher price and the XR250R winning due to a much lower price. But it definitely should be noted that the XR650L was only able to post such a decent score because of outlier performance in the wide open section. It's still fair though. It made up a lot of time fair and square by just hauling stupid speeds in the open. So was this one worth the $1,600 I have into it? So far it looks like it. I only have 5 bikes plotted on the chart for my desert course right now, but as it stands, the XR650L is below the trend line, meaning the price is justified by the performance. Honestly, this was really surprising to me. I never would have expected it to do so well, even if it only did well because it can reach very high speeds in the open. When actually riding it, it just doesn't feel like a fast machine. It doesn't feel like it wants to go contend with other machines in a performance comparison or a race. But apparently at my skill level, it has a chance at doing well. So who would the XR650L be good for? And for what type of riding? Well, first of all, I'm just going to say I'd probably be dead already if this was my beginner bike. It does not seem like a good idea for a beginner to me. It's just so heavy and tiring. I would have probably hated riding if I started on this bike, but there are many people who started out on this bike and survived. Those people are now heroes to me, because holy crap, this thing is just not very easy to ride. Second, I'm about 5'10", and I don't think I'd want this bike if I were more than an inch shorter than that. The previous owner was a tall, strong man, very much unlike myself, and even that guy, after a few decades, finally had enough of how big and heavy the 650L was, which is why he was stoked when I took it off his hands. So it's probably not good for an absolute beginner, and probably not good for smaller people. As far as the type of riding it works for, well, it definitely works well enough out here in the desert, but when things get tight and technical, it kinda starts to suck. It will definitely do it all, but you've got to have some strength and endurance to maneuver the big thing for more than a few minutes at a time. At the end of the day, I've been happy enough with the 650L. Despite being ridiculously heavy and having a flimsy front end, I still have a ton of fun when I'm riding it. It actually makes an excellent bike for just going out and goofing around on the trails. I mean, check it out. It's an old school air-cooled XR that has an electric start, is factory street legal, and is still being produced today. That's just pretty dang cool, and I'm glad we have this bike as an option. But of course, this whole review was just the perspective of one person. I'm really looking forward to hearing your opinion down in the comment section. Thanks for watching, and thanks a million to the crew on Patreon for making these videos possible.